Просто сказать спасибо. А я сейчас
Hey, everybody.
Hi, Paul.
Hey, Dario. How you doing, man?
Great. How are you?
Good.
Fine. Fine.
Oh, I'm sorry. Was that Irfan?
Yeah, that was Irfan.
I'm sorry, dude. I'm still learning your voice. Dario, my hello to you is still 100% in effect.
Okay. Hello back. Yeah, we'll wait for a couple of more minutes.
Yeah.
Quinton also confirmed for the meeting. I think he hasn't joined yet.
Yeah. Oh, there he goes.
I think this sort of became that Federation work group meeting itself, looking at the presence. And I believe this meeting is getting auto-recorded. Jonathan sent a message earlier that he has somehow enabled the auto-recording on this meeting room. Okay, I think we can.
Yeah, I think that's right.
To share? Yep. I think most of us would have seen the notes Paul sent out earlier.
Yeah, I'll put a link to this back in the chat. So this meeting, the point of having this meeting was to kind of resume brainstorming about API surface in the federated API space. And I sent a message to the mailing list. It was kind of late on Friday. With like a gist and HackMD with similar, with the same content in it that just represent a little bit of brainstorming that we've done at Red Hat that I think kind of builds on everything that's been discussed previously in Federation Working Group. I dropped that link into the chat. And I think that what I would say to folks that I'm not sure if this made it into a copy that's in that gist or in the email that I sent out, but like these are really just brainstorming. I'm not necessarily sure yet whether the ideas in that gist are partially, totally, or 0% useful, but I think probably it's best that we can at least like get this discussion started again. So I don't know where folks would like to start off, but I do think that it's probably most important not necessarily to debate like the particulars of API constructions, but if we can talk about like the breakdown of the different functional areas and agree or see if we have any kind of consensus on like that the decomposition of different functional areas is something that makes sense to people and that we think rings true about the problem space. So I'm open to suggestions on where to start. But I would suggest that we talk about the different functional areas that are kind of bound up in this problem space.
That sounds like a sound approach, Paul. But I think there is one more aspect which I thought of, or I sort of tried to point at in the previous work group sync also, is presenting the evolution of the Federation API itself to the users. So for example, we have a couple of options. One is that currently whatever Federation API, I mean, it's not really a Federation API, but the way Federation is presented to the user, it's the same K8s API, and users have some knowledge that they put some annotation on something, and if they make this request against a federation control plane, then they achieve something. So evolution from there to whatever we are calling V2, what might be the best approach to do that? So first option that might come to mind is we just uh, keep the current approach as approach 1 or whatever, and present that as approach 1 to users, and V2 as a different control plane altogether. Deployment and all this stuff remains same, but these are two parallel concepts or runtime, call them whatever, presented to the user.
Yeah, so
second,
go ahead.
let me complete. Second, which sounds like a more genuine, I have been trying to think about it a lot though. I might not be completely sure if it's doable, is that we keep that API as is and use the aggregation concepts which K8s now has, and present that as an aggregated API so that earlier users can also use the same federation control plane, and whatever we are thinking of building now can gradually be presented to those users, and the older one can be phased out in some way. This sounds like a little more genuine approach to me to evolve into, call it V2, or we can name it whichever version we want to, as federation control plane API.
Yeah, so I think that there are probably I think both of the kind of approaches and plays that you just described are valid. I think that, so one thing that like definitely dominates my thinking about like evolution versus like replacement or whatever, and this entire problem space in general, is that it's so meta, like not federation, not any particular code that exists now or doesn't exist, that there are a lot of different pieces of the problem space. And I think that one thing that we should be mindful of as we talk about this is that I think that it's probably valid for different folks with different motivations to like eventually agree to disagree. And the sweet spot in general for solving problems in multi-cluster is probably one where we can like pick and choose as users. Like if we like a particular API construction, or we like a particular flavor of distribution of resources into different clusters, there's no reason that there has to be just one. And so that definitely, if we all embrace that, I think that would help us avoid situations where we feel that we have to like, feel that we have to make a grand bargain, so to speak, and like have unanimous consensus that we eventually forge, because unanimous consensus is really, really expensive. And if we like find the right way to hit the tuning fork and make it resonate, maybe things will fall into different buckets that we can swap out what's in the bucket, right? So like, I don't know if that makes any sense, and I feel like I am starting to ramble. So I'm gonna shut my mouth now. End of file.
Yeah, I completely agree to what you are saying, that I'm also thinking on similar lines where user or per se, let's say developers also should be able to carry on work in parallel, and users should be able to consume whatever pieces are in segregation altogether, or we should, I mean, as a user should have an option of what I want to choose to use. So I don't have that on paper as yet, but what I was exploring it is like, for example, run empty aggregator as a front end, and as the extension API servers. I think, Paul, you would be much more clearer than me on this. As extension API servers, we can have different, for example, Federation could be one extension API server, and rest of the APIs in whatever group version we classify them can be another one or multiple other extension API servers, or the same API server configured in with some API or without some API, or these kind of options. But the one aggregated endpoint that user talks to can be like a K8s API server. The only possible or same way I could actually do, not really do it, could think of is like run that K8s API server with all the K8s APIs disabled and all the requests being delegated to extension servers. Okay, I don't know if this is sane, but this is just to present what I'm thinking towards. It sort of sounds like composable pieces to me.
Sorry, I think I missed the last sentence that you said about extension API servers.
Yeah, what I was trying to point out is that, for example, K8s right now provides that facility of extending the APIs. So one option, what I want to present, I could think of, I'm just giving an example of how it can be done, is you run the K8s API server and run it with all the actual K8s APIs disabled, barring some, for example, authorization or admission control, but all the apps and workload APIs disabled. And all that workload APIs requests are delegated to an extension API server, which is actually today's Federation API server. And in parallel, another extension API server is there, which is work in progress as we are talking about the API. How does this sound for composability or whatever you can call it? This is just idea of what I'm thinking at, but I don't have it on paper, or I don't have it in a proto, or which I can actually say that this actually works.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a possibility. And so to give an example of applying the concept I was just kind of throwing around to a particular area, like one functional area of this problem space is, how do we represent API resources and represent their, like, if you want to differentiate a part of them in a particular cluster, how do we represent that? And I think that there are probably a number of different ways that we could do that. And one of them would, like you've just described one of them, Irfan. And let me make sure that I understood what you said, so that I'm not making a wrong assumption. So I think the approach that you were talking about is, like, we could have a Kubernetes API server with the controllers disabled, basically, and maybe special admission control, and that could be where the resources, the main Kubernetes resources lived, and then there could be some other API groups that handle different elements of the problem space, right? Basically, that's what you were describing.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that's.
Like that.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I meant something like that.
Yeah. So that's one flavor, right? I think there could be another flavor where you know, some of us build API groups that have, like, first-class variants of the important controller types, like federated deployment or whatever, and those might be aggregated together with the cluster registry, and maybe also with, like, the Kubernetes, main Kubernetes, like a normal Kubernetes. And then I think there are probably, like, a couple other variants too, where for example, maybe you can use something like Helm and have Helm charts, and maybe a future version of Helm might have some feature that lets you plunk out API resources in particular clusters that came from the cluster registry. Or maybe you have your own template set up, right? And I think that probably it's natural and good for those things to coexist instead of trying to force everybody into one kind of particular API construction or pattern. And that also, lets us potentially compete in like the marketplace of ideas. But I'll stop here because I'm getting that feeling like I'm just like rambling, and I wonder if that example makes sense to people, that there's maybe like fundamentally different approaches that we can take for that particular part of the problem space. And I think it's okay for different approaches to coexist and natural.
Okay, I'll take 5 more minutes. I actually did not intend to talk about how the pieces could be constructed and sort of deployed or run. I actually wanted to point out at the API itself when it is presented to the user. Like when user consumes, today if the user consumes, it is actually the K8s API, a subset of K8s API. For example, replica sets. The way replica sets today exist, the same API would be invoked against today's Federation control plane, and it just works. With some, if there are no annotations, there are some default annotations. So this remains, plus whatever we call V2, that is presented as, for example, in your gist you published, the API group could be federation.apps.ktest.io/v1alpha1 or something like that. Both of them co-presented to the user. There's an option also to do that. I was trying to think this as the API transition. As one option, like what I talked about, option 1 and option 2. I was trying to think hard for this transition and how this could be presented to the user. If it makes sense, if we decide that this option is not really a good option, then I don't want to keep on talking about the same thing. Like, as you said, I'm rambling about the same thing, right?
So let me try to jump in here. So what I'm hearing is what we call Federation V1, should that be coexist with at least what Paul has been putting forth, which is different ideas that would form the basis of V2. And I think what I'm hearing Irfan say is, should the upgrade path from V1 to V2 be a necessary condition in order to even start talking about V2?
You exactly pointed it out, right, Christian. This is what I'm trying to point out at.
So I think for different people within the SIG, that upgrade path may be at different levels of importance, depending on where people sit. But I think everybody agrees that what we call V2, which is more focused on use cases, and I think it's what's reflected currently in the document that Paul sent out, we should find some common ground there. And I'd be like, I wouldn't put the upgrade path as a blocker to try to iterate and make progress on V2, because we already know there's mechanisms that you could aggregate V1 and V2 and then spend time separately trying to determine what an upgrade path would be for V1 and V2 to coexist.
Okay, let's move ahead. Yeah, that sounds right, quite right to me, Christian. Let's move ahead.
So maybe this is a good time to discuss like the different functional areas that are all kind of bound up in what we talk about as being federation. So I can, let's see. I think this is in there's a section of this in the gist, so we don't have to rely on my feeble brain. I will drop a link into the chat. But thinking about this,
You can share your desktop also.
okay, it'll take me a moment to clean up and get ready to
Okay,
share.
I'll share it for you.
Okay, great, thanks.
Okay.
Okay, so the thing I linked is what's at the top of Irfan's screen, and thinking about how like the different behaviors and features that are either like already implemented in the current federation, or are things that are part of the problem space that we eventually hope to solve. There's kind of 5-ish, and some of these you can maybe break into 1 or 2. So between 5 and 7 different functional areas, right? And the core one is probably, or the first one is probably what most people begin to think of when they start thinking about this problem space, is that like, I want to be able to express a base or template for a resource, and then possibly override parts of this in a particular cluster. So maybe I have a deployment and its replica count is normally 5, but in cluster X, I want the replica count to be 10. And in cluster Y, I want the replica count to be 20, for example. Any questions on that one, or thoughts people want to share as we go through this list?
Yeah, I had a quick comment, which is I don't think those overrides necessarily need to be per cluster, and in many cases we explicitly, or users explicitly, do not want to specify clusters by name, but rather the overrides are based on some more general selection mechanism. To give a concrete example, you know, deploy this template into North America and Europe, but in North America, you know, give it the North American config, and in Europe, give it the European config. And there's no mention of a specific cluster name in there.
I gotcha. Yeah, I see what you mean. So like explicitly naming in this cluster do this versus like selection, or at a more abstract layer like a policy, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the reason I bring it up is not just to try and be general, but the whole problem space here is around not having to, you know, deal individually with clusters, but rather deal with federated things like deployments.
Yeah. So I plus one that, Quentin. I guess when I wrote that particular piece of English, I had been thinking of like eventually they go into a cluster, and eventually like some of those are differentiated from the template in some way. I think you're exactly right that like probably in the long term, especially policy and selection are like where more people their hearts and minds lie than explicitly naming clusters, which is going to get really annoying fast, right?
So in this space, I was thinking more we would call out the labels, specifically what we try to apply to cluster registry, and that you can apply labels to your clusters. So that allows to have more coarse selection. And with regards to the Europe versus US example, I think there's a point in that, I mean, we call it policy configuration, but if the configurations are sufficiently different such that the deployment spec itself would be completely different, at this point, maybe we're not trying to solve, we shouldn't be solving this at the meta federated level and just punt it and say, these are 2 different deployments.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Christian.
Hey, this is Greg Harmon with Staying with Christian. I was wondering, are the templates allowed to be sort of nested? Like, could you do this by saying, you know, I'm going to add some more details in a second template, like for like a EU template versus an American template?
So I think that that this is an area where like you can probably do all manner of things, and I'm not sure that I think it's probably best to talk about like the different functional areas before we drill down too far into the implementation of any particular thing. But here's where I think of like there are probably enough different approaches and folks that like will really like a particular approach for solving this functional area that it's probably inevitable that there will be different approaches that get implemented for this one in particular, especially.
Okay, yeah, that's fair enough.
But just again, in order to maybe reason about this in terms of not over-engineering, just like you wouldn't have two pod specs for a replica set spec, I wouldn't expect us to have two different templates for one higher level object.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to make a similar comment to, I think, what Christian was alluding to, which is that I think the necessity to override things and customize them per cluster is, and this is just a speculation, is relatively limited. And while one could, you know, infinitely customize each template as it goes into a different cluster, at some point it becomes a different thing if you over customize it. And besides that, I think we could go around and around in circles for a very long time trying to decide how much should be customizable and how to customize it. I was wondering whether a first departure point wouldn't be just to say there is no customization other than relative weights and sizes of things. So in the case of a replica set, you know, the count of replicas is one obvious thing which might be different in different clusters. And then perhaps use that as a starting point and say, what concrete use cases don't work with that? And then incrementally allow further customization where absolutely necessary, rather than starting from the other extreme and saying, what can we customize and how do we do that? Which seems like it might be an endless rabbit hole.
This also reminds me of like Brian Grant's spec where he talked about layering things on top, and maybe a different abstraction is that we allow customization, but it is done through an API object which can be layered on top based on a cluster level selector. So if the cluster has a label of US, then we apply another, it's effectively a wraparound kubectl apply. And then you almost don't have to declare what is and is not allowed, because anything that is allowed by the API can be layered.
Yes.
That's a little meta though.
Kind of a cascade model. I mean, anytime we find something contentious, being able to separate it out and iterate on it separate, like independently, I think is a win.
Yeah, I agree. So let's move on in this list just to keep paying attention to time. So there's the template and overrides, and then there's also how do things get placed into clusters, which you can like we can probably easily all imagine a few different approaches, right? Like there's similar to like expressing overrides, maybe there's like room for explicit placement. Like you might have a resource that's like, I want you to put these particular resources into this cluster. You might have maybe something more of selection that's like using these label selectors, apply all the resources that you know about into these clusters. You might also select the clusters with the selector, or you might have an even more abstract policy component. But seems like another axis in the problem space. And if my math analogies ever get annoying, or like way more math than my very little math that I know and I'm just wrong, feel free to tell me to shut up. But like, it seems like an independent axis, right? From how do you declare these things versus how do you say where they should go? And now I will shut up again.
So how's that different from, so we've been talking about templates. To me, when you say template, that is the, what are these things? And when we talk about overrides or placement, or even below that, you have scheduling. To me, that's where they go and how many of them there are.
Yeah, so that's a valid point. Just to try to express what's in my mind, or explain better what this language refers to. You can definitely think of the differentiation of a resource as far as like where it goes as potentially being placement too. And I agree that there is an overlap with scheduling and placement. But I think that the first bullet in this list is what. And the second bullet fundamentally is where. Does that distinction make sense?
What? Sorry. I was saying I agree with what on the first bullet, but then the overrides per cluster, that to me is goes into where, or because I guess some of the examples you showed were about replica counts, so that tends to collide with scheduling, right?
It could, but I mean, you could have it manually defined. I want this many replicas in this cluster, or you could have a more like where the user specifying it, but the user could also be specifying how they want the scheduler to treat that resource, and those are, I think, fundamentally different, like declarations.
Yeah. So, for example, like scheduling, and just to level set, when we're talking about scheduling, I think we're all referring to something that's like, take these replica sets that are like derived from the same thing, they're placed into different clusters, and we want to, using some information about the actual state of the world, manipulate those replica counts to achieve some goal, right? Like in a way where something is looking at what's happening in cluster X, Y, and Z, and maybe the traffic going into them, or CPU utilization, whatever, and like coordinating the replica counts in this example across different clusters. Is that what you're talking about, Christian?
No, I was just trying to make sense of where you, I wasn't talking about anything. I was trying to understand your where and what analogy.
I think I'm kind of new to the group, so I just want to throw this out there. How are we differentiating vocabulary-wise between cluster-level scheduling and federation-level scheduling, in that I kind of feel like these are two different things. The cluster-level scheduling is information we want to transmit down to the cluster, whereas the federation-level scheduling is something else entirely. It sounds like we're conflating the two a little, but I'm new here, so maybe not.
Yeah, I think that it would help us to specify exactly what some of these terms meant to disambiguate them. I took that to be your point.
Yeah, because, I mean, when I'm talking about replication across a single cluster, like I want to differentiate, give a concrete example, like differentiate number of replicas in Europe versus number of replicas in Australia. That's just information I want to communicate to the cluster. And yes, I have to denote that somewhere at the federation level because it needs to be communicated, but it's not so much like how and where these things get bounced across regions. if that makes sense. I think they're two different things. But yeah, clarifying terminology is probably a good place to start with that.
Okay, point taken, and I think that's a good point. So circling back to Christian, your comment, TLDR, I think that it's very arguable that like there's some collision between placement and overrides, and higher level behaviors are also like rebalancing across clusters probably feed into those too. We've just been trying to pick them apart so we can think about them in kind of an ordered way. I am appreciative if anybody can find a better decomposition. I definitely think that the answer is not, the ultimate answer is not contained on Irfan's screen share right now. I'll say that.
I think it's helpful. Sorry, go ahead, Irfan.
Yeah, go ahead, man. Okay, what I was suggesting is that rather than 5 of these functional areas, we can have 4 of them. So one would be the template, the other would be the placement, third would be the first 3 actually contain the template and the placement, as Christian was talking about, what and where. Status is different from these because it's like some feedback from the current state or whatever it is. And scheduling is something dynamic, like the earlier first and second and third point are something which start at the beginning, like when a user request comes in. Whereas the scheduling is which is sort of everlasting or reconcile loop kind of a thing which goes on. So how about the 4 functional areas?
I think 5 is appropriate as per Justin's example. I think having overrides as a separate resource allows sort of experimentation with different mechanisms for implementing that. So I prefer not to have it included in the template.
Whoops, mute button operation. Yeah, honestly, I don't think that to take we don't all have to have unanimous consent. Like it's totally acceptable for all of us to see these things differently. And when it comes to like actual APIs that we implement, like there's no need to have unanimous consent. So if someone has a flavor of like a formulation for an API that describes overrides and placement that they think really is valuable, there's no reason that we should all have to agree and implement only one thing.
I should say I'm not trying to suggest that the implementation has to have these 5 distinct areas or even 5 distinct resources. But I think, I mean, just for going back to Christian's example of, well, if I'm doing overrides, that kind of is, I'm indicating maybe the clusters I want these overrides applied to, how is that different from placement? I think in my mind, they could be the same thing in a given implementation, but it could be that you want to separate them because maybe placement is something you want to control administratively and you want to use RBAC to control that, whereas you want to give users access to provide cluster level overrides. And if those things are the same resource, you have a limited ability to administer that. So to my mind, keeping them separate doesn't preclude someone who doesn't have that administrative requirement from having one resource. But if we just think conceptually of having them potentially being separate, it just gives people more options. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess it makes sense. I think for me, concretely, I would reason about it more if I get a list of like typically what you would want to override. Clearly, we mentioned replica count. I think somewhere in the document, there's like a per cluster override for a particular version, for example. Yeah, the V4, V3 or something. There's where I'm not completely, I mean, we're starting into like sufficiently changing the base template I don't know if it's sufficiently, but we're changing the template, and then that kind of begs the question whether these should be two separate objects instead of just one.
Sorry, which resources are we talking about?
Yeah,
I didn't entirely file that. Can you restate?
I have to scroll there. I think it's in the example, the replica set example. There, that GB front end v4 versus v3.
Oh, varying the image. Yeah.
Right, varying the image or.
I think another thing you might override is like a storage location. You have different storage bucket for different clusters, for different regions.
So the concern was that you would want to have the override separate, or you wouldn't? I'm confused.
Like, I'm not sure this ties to a particular use case. Seems like if you're rolling out a new version in a new cluster, it's simpler to make it a separate object and manage that object separately rather than.
The use case is maybe just not clear. I mean, we were just trying to pick something that would demonstrate, like, I want to override something per cluster, but I mean, we're not suggesting this is the best way to do this particular thing, like varying images across clusters. If you could think of a better reason why I'd want to do overrides, like, we'd happily incorporate that example instead of this one.
Yeah.
So I guess my higher level point is, aside from replica counts, do you have anything in mind that you want to override?
I think storage locations was something we talked about in previous discussions.
Yeah, I think probably labels and annotations, image versions, and there's probably a few things that are like, details in the pod spec, like environment variables, particular environment variables that you want to override, or
mounted secrets.
But I think the goal was just having a generic way of allowing overrides for a given cluster, set of clusters, and it wasn't like we need to be prescriptive about how that would be used. It just seems like people would benefit from this capability, and separating it out at least would mean that a given implementation, maybe even the first pass, could ignore that requirement entirely. And just, if you need to vary replica count, you can do some sort of scheduling magic.
I guess one interesting thing to think about just in all of this is, how much does the Federation project prescribe how you'll use Federation versus building something that users are choosing, like, all right, there's a lot of capability here. How do the users figure out what to do? I think it's kind of like one of the interesting problems of Kubernetes, that a lot of times the people who are building these things in Kubernetes and designing them are not the people who are actually administering clusters that use them, which in this case for Federation, I think is especially true because, and for multi-cluster things, most of us, I know I personally have maybe managed a few development clusters on my own. I federated them only because I was testing Federation, but versus users who actually have multiple clusters in the real world and can address these problems. It sounds like this design approach is leaning more towards, we're going to make a more generic set of capabilities, things that maybe let users do a lot of things that we hadn't thought about, and then as users, they can then decide, okay, this seems like it would be useful to me, which I think is probably a good thing, but is also a dangerous thing, because it potentially leads to a world where there's a lot of, for a while, confusion, where it takes some time to find the best practices.
But I think the goal is to allow evolution and iteration. And it's not that maybe upstream we might focus on a particular approach or strategy that seems to, solve as many people's problems as possible.
Yeah.
But if a given user needed to or wanted to vary that behavior, they could, implement a new resource type and implement a new controller, and it would integrate well. And that has been traditionally a problem. I think that is more in keeping with Kubernetes. Like, if you install Kubernetes, you get, a set of resources and a set of controllers. And if you want to vary that behavior, you technically can go in and change the resources and change the controllers. It may be tightly integrated in some areas, but that's the goal. And I think if we start from that as the baseline, I think we're more likely to be successful than if we're preventing people from experimenting or making it difficult.
Yeah, so one thing I want to just call out for everybody is that the content that's in this gist, these are all straw man constructions to explore the problem space. Like, they're not prescriptions in any way. And we're still trying to figure out, like, when we talk about this at Red Hat, which of these ideas are valuable and which aren't. So do keep that in mind as you read, that you should see like a like expression on the author's face, like maybe let's see when you read it. The other one,
I think it served as a strong basis to foster much discussion as part of it too. So
Yeah.
thanks for specifying, but it's well understood.
okay.
I want to chime in real quick. I think as initial offering, maybe overrides or absence of override is perfectly fine, just to say that we start with that. By the way, it's Ilya. But I also would like to caution that absence of override may preclude users from using Federation altogether. In our case, we desperately need Federation, but we have specific examples where we need to override bare minimum replica counts, HPA settings, annotations, because those are tied to specific clusters, whether it's ELB annotations, whether it's storage annotations. So those will be specific per cluster. And while it's initially is fine to not have that at all, we definitely need to think forward and add in it.
Yeah, point taken. The responding to, I'm not sure if I can identify voices correctly, but the comment that was made about being, and I'm just paraphrasing here, having something that's general that is very flexible, but may also be difficult to kind of get some traction on as a developer. Like, I think that's a really good point. And I think that one thing to keep in mind as we like talk about this problem space is what is this like for you as a user? And I would also love to have some real live users that could take a look at these ideas as we talk about them and say, hey, that one looks really good, or I'm not sure what that means immediately, and maybe give us some kind of feedback as we go. It might be great if we could identify people that are already trying to solve these problems, like on the ground in their own clusters, that can provide some kind of validation or at least feedback of the ideas that we're brainstorming. So the next bullet on there is propagation of placed resources into clusters. And what that means is, as distinct from articulating where do things go, how do they get there? And there's a few different approaches like that are probably all valid depending on the use case. There's probably room for an approach that's like, take all of these resources that have to go into a particular cluster and put them into a Git repo and use something like kubeapplier as a backend to actually get them there, versus have a controller that's actively maintaining a connection to each target cluster and doing the reconciliation in like an online type of fashion. But that's what propagation of placed resources into cluster refers to. And I'm stopping talking there if anyone wants to share thoughts on this dimension.
When I read this first time, what I understood was this actually points about in what fashion the resource needs to be propagated to the cluster. So, for example, a resource has to be partitioned and propagated. I remember this came as use case earlier in one of the discussions. I don't remember exactly which one. Or the resource has to be, for example, the replica set can be copied into each cluster, or it could be partitioned and then sub-replica set or replica set with reduced replicas can be propagated into each cluster.
I think if I can paraphrase Paul, my understanding is that all of what you just described is actually placement in the terminology in the document. And once it has been decided exactly what needs to go into each cluster, propagation is just the act of getting it there.
Yep, exactly.
I think when I think about sorry, Quint, was that somebody else?
Oh, I was just going to say, and if we're going to discuss the notion of overrides, is a propagation that alters from the norm would be an override of a placement, I think. Placement defines the propagation in general, and then if you need to change that, how it propagates in a specific cluster, unless I'm misunderstanding that.
Propagation is the process that gets, like, that actually puts the resources into the other cluster. It calls the API, etc. So there's kind of a separation here between defining what you want to happen, defining your template, your overrides, your placement directive, and then the propagation mechanism would actually takes all that and interfaces with the clusters, or at least the configuration the clusters are going to be reading from. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Yeah, so I would make the analogy of like propagation is differentiating, like do you want ground shipping or do you want air? Like either way the thing's going to get there. The question is what mechanism gets it there. Like is it a controller that's watching some API surface and is like, now I need to like reconcile this resource in cluster X, Y, and Z? Or is it like, do you have something that's bundling things up into like Git repos or tarballs and putting them on some highly available storage or something like that, and then something in the cluster is pulling it down?
Yeah, I think this is actually a really valuable thing to pull out, just because I think probably from when I think about this, the most complicated problem that this brings up and the most complicated bit of this is going to be dealing with what user or what service account is doing these things and making sure that it's properly auditable and logged and that events are generated properly. I know that this sort of, the propagation into clusters was always a bit, the authentication and authorization piece of that was always something that was difficult for Federation, that we required quite a bit of thinking, and that I don't know if we ever came to a clear resolution on how that would work. So the idea of splitting this out and potentially allowing different models, I think, is really valuable. I mean, I could even imagine a model where, maybe a very restrictive model, but a model where the Federation, the declaration, overrides, and placement ends up producing at some endpoint YAML files that a user is told, like that the user knows that they can go with their own kubectl and upload themselves by hand. Like I could imagine that being some sort of a policy where these things have to be done by users or have to be done by some administrative user, not by a machine.
One brief comment, and this actually applies across several of these areas, is that there is, in a more sophisticated implementation of these ideas, there is some inherent bleed between these areas. So to give some specific examples, so the placement decision might be based on where there is quota for the user that is placing the resources, or which clusters are available, and perhaps even the status of related objects. So that it's in practice, it's possible to decouple these phases entirely, but in practice you often end up with kind of like loopbacks where we made a placement decision, we attached a propagation strategy to that, but then the propagation strategy failed on one of the clusters because there was no capacity or no quota, or the credentials for the propagator were invalid, or whatever the case may be. So therefore, we may need to go back and make a different placement decision, which may then result in a different override or different retemplating process in the first step. Just want to point that out.
I think at the bottom where we talk about like possible implementation for defining scheduling preferences, because I think there's a sort of a separation in my mind between placement directives, which is kind of like user defined, be a selector or something. But then there's like scheduling directives, and the whole process of scheduling, to me, that's something that it's distinct from the placement side of it. Does that, I'm not explaining this well, but just to differentiate scheduling versus placement. Placement is user defined. Scheduling can be completely dynamic and really complicated, but they're separate.
I don't see them as separate personally. I see what the user specifies as input into the scheduling policy. So user says, on one extreme of that, user says, I want this thing in cluster A, and the scheduler says, right, I will do basically very little other than say, yes, you can put it in cluster A, or I want it in any cluster in Europe, is what the user specifies, in which case the scheduler makes a more specific decision. And the equivalent in Kubernetes would be, I want a pod, I don't care where it goes, and the scheduler picks a node, or the user says, I want a pod with label blue, and then the scheduler chooses one of the blue labeled pods, or the user specifies, I want this on node X, in which case the scheduler puts it on node X.
I was just trying to differentiate between, like, the scheduler doesn't change the placement directive. It tries to respect it, and if it can't, it can't, but it's not defining the placement directive as we're defining in this document. That's all I'm trying to say. I agree that it's input to the scheduling algorithm the same way that the scheduling preferences at the bottom are. The point here isn't to say you have to break things up. It's very likely that an advanced implementation would conjoin a lot of this stuff. It's just being able to separate it out so that other implementations have the opportunity to choose whether they implement a given capability rather than being forced to.
So we're just about at time. In fact, I was hoping that we could talk a little about status, but I think we're almost at time. So do we want to perhaps continue this discussion in Federation Working Group this week? Do people think this was useful?
Is there a way to comment the document? Sorry, I don't know the HackMD tool that you sent.
The HackMD thing is basically like an Etherpad that also has a pane where it renders the markdown. You can probably leave probably the best way to comment is comment on a gist, on the gist that's linked in there. In retrospect, it was probably mostly just confusing to share the HackMD.
Okay. Can you copy paste this in a Google Doc? Is that too hard to reconcile afterwards?
Yeah, I would be willing to. Yeah.
If there's other ideas, I'm welcome to those.
Yeah. There's no good tool for doing what we want to do, I don't think.
Thank you, Paul. I would appreciate a Google Doc or potentially even a PR in the community repo or something. Just that would work as well if we didn't want to use Google Docs. But I think at this phase, Google Docs is probably a good tool. There's going to be a lot of commenting. Later on, GitHub is a better tool for preserving the state.
Jonathan, is that you?
Yes.
Okay, I thought so. Okay, yeah, I'll drop it in a Google Doc, and I have to drop now, but maybe we can continue discussing this in Federation Working Group this week.
Yeah, it seems like having an agreement on the functional areas, whether it's 4 or 5. Now they're like terse terms, but if we have an agreement on what we mean, that would help going forward.
Yeah, and I will put some explanatory text on each of these to give a TLDR so that we can tell them apart.
Okay, it's not easy, I know. So.
Yes. Yeah, well, if it was easy, someone else would already have done it, right? So. All right. Thanks everybody for joining. I thought this was a very good discussion.
Thank you for putting the document together.
All right. See ya.
Bye.